David had always prided himself on being an observant man, a quiet, steady presence in his family. He had learned to read the smallest shifts in behavior, the nervous flick of an eye, the hesitation in a voice, the uneasy weight of a secret. It was that same instinct that made him notice something was off with Michael. At 22, Michael had always been confident, almost effortlessly charming. He had inherited his mother's quick wit and his father's strong features, a combination that made people trust him easily. But lately there had been a shift. Small at first, then undeniable. Michael had begun avoiding eye contact during dinner. His laughter felt hollow, and his phone, once casually placed on the counter, never left his pocket now. The excuses, too, had started piling up. Long nights at work, sudden errands, unexplained absences. David never believed in snooping. Trust was the foundation of their family. But when a man has raised a son, when he has taught him right from wrong, has watched him take his first steps, fall and rise again, he knows when something doesn't add up. It was a Wednesday night when the truth began to unravel. David had been in the garage, tightening the hinges on an old cabinet, when he heard the hurried footsteps above him. Michael's voice, low, urgent, filtered through the open vent. "Yeah, don't worry. She has no idea." David paused, tightening his grip on the screwdriver. "I told her I'm working late. She's too trusting, honestly. It's almost too easy." A silence followed, then a quiet chuckle, one that made David's stomach turn. He knew that tone. It was the kind of laugh a man gives when he believes he's invincible. David didn't move. He barely breathed. Michael's footsteps creaked down the stairs, his voice still hushed. When the front door clicked shut, David followed, moving with a kind of silent precision only a father could master. From the window, he watched Michael slip into his car and drive off into the night. David had two choices. He could pretend he hadn't heard anything. He could let doubt fester, convincing himself that maybe, just maybe, he had misunderstood. Or he could find out the truth. 15 minutes later, David's truck trailed behind his son's car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He kept a safe distance, watching as Michael weaved through familiar streets before turning onto an unfamiliar road, a dimly lit side street near the edge of town. Michael parked beside a rundown motel, the kind of place people went when they wanted to disappear. David's pulse thudded in his ears. His chest felt tight. He wanted to be wrong. More than anything, he wanted to be wrong. But then the car door opened and he saw her. A woman stepped out of the shadows. Not Emma. Not the girl who had been a part of their family for the last 4 years, who had sat at their dinner table, who had loved his son with unwavering devotion. Well, this woman was different. Her hair was dark, her movements practiced. She approached Michael with a familiarity that shattered any lingering doubt. When Michael wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, David felt something inside him break. He couldn't move. He had seen many things in his life: the cruelty of betrayal, the selfishness of men who valued impulse over integrity. But never had he imagined he would witness it in his own flesh and blood. His son. His boy. The child he had raised to be better than this. David exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. He wasn't a man given to impulsivity. He needed time to think, process. But one thing was certain. Michael had just crossed a line he could never uncross. And David would make sure he faced the consequences. David barely remembered the drive home. His hands felt like they were moving on their own, gripping the wheel, shifting gears, steering his truck through the dark streets of a town that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Inside his chest, a storm raged, anger, disappointment, and a deep, aching sorrow. How had it come to this? How had his son, the boy he had raised with unwavering principles, become a man capable of such deceit? The house was quiet when he stepped inside. Too quiet. Lena sat at the kitchen table, her fingers curled around a mug of tea. A book lay open in front of her, though she wasn't reading. She looked up when David entered, her gaze lingering on his face. "You're home late," she said softly. David hesitated. He was never good at lying, not to her. But how could he tell her what he had just witnessed? How could he shatter the illusion of the son she believed in? Had to check on something, he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. He kissed her forehead, feeling the warmth of her skin against his lips. A simple gesture, yet it filled him with guilt. Because tonight, for the first time in their marriage, he was keeping something from her. The weight of the secret. David barely slept. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic breathing of his wife beside him. Michael's voice echoed in his mind. She has no idea. It's almost too easy. By morning, David had made a decision. He wouldn't rush into confrontation. Not yet. He needed to understand the full scope of his son's betrayal before deciding what to do next. Over breakfast, Michael appeared as if nothing had changed. He walked into the kitchen, ruffled his hair, poured himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," he said casually, flashing the same easy grin that had always gotten him out of trouble as a boy. David studied him carefully. He saw no remorse, no hesitation, no sign of guilt. Emma arrived minutes later, greeting Michael with a kiss on the cheek. David couldn't help but watch. The way she looked at him, the way she trusted him completely. And Michael, he played the part perfectly. He wrapped an arm around her waist, whispered something in her ear that made her laugh. A well-rehearsed lie. David clenched his jaw. It wasn't just that Michael had cheated. It was how effortlessly he deceived the people who loved him. And that was what David couldn't ignore. Testing the waters. "Michael," David said suddenly, setting his coffee down. "Can you give me a hand outside?" Michael hesitated just for a second, a flicker of unease in his eyes. But then the mask returned, and he nodded. "Sure, Dad." They stepped into the backyard, the morning air crisp and cool. Birds chirped in the distance, a stark contrast to the tension growing between them. David took a slow breath. "How's work been?" Michael shrugged. "Busy. Same as usual." "And last night?" Michael stilled, his hand tightening around the fence post he was leaning against. "What about last night?" His voice was controlled, but David saw it now, the faintest crack in his composure. David let the question hang between them, giving Michael just enough time to realize he was caught. I was working late," Michael said, his smile faltering. "Didn't get home until after midnight." David nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Funny," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Because I could have sworn I saw you somewhere else." Michael's face paled. There it was, the moment of recognition. He opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling to find the right words. For the first time in his life, his charm wouldn't save him. "I don't know what you think you saw," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. David exhaled. He had his answer. And Michael knew it. Line drawn. "I'm going to give you a chance," David said, his voice quiet but firm. "A chance to come clean. To do the right thing." Michael's jaw clenched. "Dad." "You have until the end of the week," David interrupted. "Tell Emma. Or I will." Michael's eyes darkened, his usual confidence slipping away. "That's not your decision to make." David took a step closer, his gaze hard as steel. "I raised you to be better than this," he said. "If you're man enough to cheat, be man enough to face the consequences." Silence stretched between them. For the first time Michael looked away. "I need time," he muttered. David nodded. "You've got 4 days." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing there, trapped in the mess he had created. Michael had always been a smooth talker, quick with a smile, quicker with an excuse. He had spent years perfecting the art of slipping through life's cracks without consequence. But now, standing in the doorway of his childhood home, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest: doubt. His father's ultimatum loomed over him, a quiet threat that held more weight than any raised voice ever could. David was not a man who made empty promises. he said Michael had 4 days, he meant every second of it. And Michael wasn't sure what terrified him more: the possibility of losing Emma, or the realization that, for the first time, he had truly disappointed his father. A fractured family. Dinner that evening was suffocating. Lena, unaware of the war waging beneath the surface, chatted about an upcoming community event. Emma sat beside Michael, her hand resting casually on his, her presence a painful reminder of the life he was actively destroying. David said little. His silence was louder than any accusation. Every time Michael met his father's eyes, he saw the quiet judgment, the unspoken challenge. Michael forced himself to eat, to nod along to conversations, but his stomach churned. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't so bad, that his father would never find out, that Emma would never get hurt. But now the illusion had shattered, and all that remained was the weight of his own selfishness. A reckoning in the dark. That night, unable to sleep, Michael found himself standing outside, staring at the vast emptiness of the backyard. The cool night air did little to calm his nerves. He heard the screen door creak behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was his father. David stepped beside him, hands in his pockets, gazing at the same darkness. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, "Do you love her?" David's voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. Michael exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. "Yeah," he said. "I do." David nodded, as if weighing the truth of those words. "Then why betray her?" Michael swallowed hard. He had no good answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. "I guess I thought I could have both." David let out a breath, a sound that was not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. "Greed," he said simply. "That's what you're describing." Michael flinched. He had expected disappointment. What he hadn't expected was the brutal simplicity of the truth. "You weren't trapped, Michael. You weren't cornered. You made a choice," David continued, his voice measured. "A choice that had consequences. And now you're out of time." Michael turned to face him, panic creeping in. "Dad." "No." David's voice was firm. "You don't get to stall. You don't get to twist your way out of this. You tell Emma tomorrow. And if you don't, I will." Michael felt his stomach drop. Tomorrow. That wasn't enough time. He needed more time. More excuses. More ways to fix this without losing everything. But when he looked at his father, he realized there was no room for negotiation. David's face was set in stone. The final warning. "You're my son," David said, quieter now. "I'll always love you. But right now, I don't respect you." Michael inhaled sharply. He had expected anger, maybe even rage. But this was worse. David turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You want to be a man, Michael? Then act like one." And with that, he was gone, leaving Michael alone in the cold. For the first time in his life, he didn't know how to talk his way out of this. Tomorrow was coming, and there was nowhere left to hide.